Our next speaker is an engineering director at Spotify, supporting their $100 million ads business. Oh, that's a lot of money. Their true passion is to inspire people to do their best work. Please welcome Nivia Henry.
I'm going to talk about leading through uncertainty, but maybe my topic should be preparing for a conference, expecting uncertainty. I thought you did a fabulous job, Daria. Thank you so much for keeping us warm, and thank you very much for coming today. A funny thing happened when I first was invited to speak here after I got over the initial excitement. Oh, Hungary, I wonder what's going on there. How's the food like? Which is my first question before I plan any trip. First, I plan the food. Very important priority. Anyway, I started to sit down and write the outline of my talk, and then by the time I got here, I have completely rewritten my talk, and I think that is a very emergent design way of creating software presentations. And so the results you'll see here, hopefully, is a good combination of where my thinking started and then how it's evolved in reaction to some of the wonderful conversations I've been having with you fantastic people during the conference. So one of the first things I realized is, as we talked about leading with uncertainty, we first need to establish ourselves with the word leading, and ultimately what we mean by leading, and ultimately what we mean by leading well, a good leader. So I decided to morph this talk into a first principles, if I may, and think about the word good in this context. First, you did a wonderful job, but I'll tell you just a little bit more about who I am and my values and why I am motivated by this talk, and maybe you could see a little bit of that in yourself. As you mentioned, Daria, that I'm Nivia. I have been at Spotify for the past 7 years, leading and supporting teams. My previous team was about 200 people total across 7 squads, as we called them. We love naming things. So across 7 squads in it used to be called Tribe, it's now called Studio. Actually, recently I decided to take on a new challenge, which is I'm leading a new organization within Spotify to help us bring some very interesting experiences. I can't say too much more, but definitely look out for those experiences for those of you who are Spotify subscribers or free users. If you're not, what are you waiting for? Let's go. Anyway, some of my other passions include the fact that I'm a cat mom. All mom types are valid, and mine is a cat mom. And I'm also wife and peer of my husband. He's a system engineer, a wonderful engineer, and he and I talk shop a lot at home. Haitian American, I'm very curious, and my pronouns are she, they, them. So back to this conversation here. Basically, I feel like where we are today is the 4th episode of 2020. In other words, we're still facing bumpy times. And really, when I think about bumpy times, I think about almost like it's become an array of bumpy times. It's no longer just 1 or 2 things that have become bumpy. We're facing an uncertain outlook, right? There's COVID still happening. There's financial turmoil, there's ongoing conflict. There's also a ton of bumpiness in this current cycle of tech, right? So what I mean by that is we've been hearing about these tech layoffs, and they seem to be ongoing. These are not necessarily new, but I think what's new about this moment is almost like the compounding effects, where we no longer have moments of rest in between these bumpy times, these events. It's almost like waves and waves. Another wave that's coming that I'm personally unhappy about is the fact that I feel like during the pandemic, the height of the pandemic, especially during quarantine for many of us, we actually gained a lot of workers' rights. In other words, the ability and right to work remotely, and being more intentional and thoughtful with how we spend our time. And I feel like this new bumpy time is the fact that those rights, I think, are being reversed. And I'm really sad about that. I see a couple of nods, so I'm not alone in being a little sad about that. And the next bumpy thing and bumpy time item in this array of bumpiness is the fact that our tech leaders are imploding in real time. We've all watched with horror and amazement at how Twitter is quickly going from the public square to just like the public garbage dump almost. We're seeing metaverse sort of be billed and hailed as the next big thing, and then really some people are calling it the death of metaverse, maybe premature, maybe not. And then, of course, Netflix used to be these are the mangas, right? And Netflix was one of the mangas that was hailed as a stable bastion of tech and tech companies, and even it's going through its own uncertainty. And that's just 3 examples. So yeah, basically, my GIFs won't work because it's PDF, but basically our tech leadership is basically a lovely dumpster fire right now with a smiley face. And yeah, this is how I feel about the moments at work. And I think a lot of people feel that way. This is a recent study that came out regarding post-pandemic. It's almost a mood check from the American Psychological Association. So while this was a US-based study, I think it applies where ultimately all of these bumpy times, these external factors are converging, and they're converging into stress at work. And a big contributing factor to the stress at work is the people at work, right? And most specifically, our leaders. Our relationship with our leaders is critical to our own satisfaction and engagement at an organization. And so when we're not happy with that relationship, we will quit our bosses. So this is another survey done by Gallup recently that basically asked people who are either leaving or thinking about leaving, hopefully anonymously they asked them, but you never know. And the result was that 50% of them have left or plan to leave as a result of being unhappy with their bosses. People will quit their jobs, or people will quit their bosses as a result of being unhappy with that relationship, even if they're okay at work, with everything else at work. You might ask yourself, well, corporations, they spend so much time training these managers, hopefully. Sometimes maybe not, but hopefully corporations spend a lot of time training our leaders. So what's going on? What is not resonating in the ground one-to-one with managers and teams? And I like this quote from Ruth Milan on Twitter, but basically there's a study showing that the leadership training is actually not working, or more specifically, it's not lasting. The leaders, managers, et cetera, go into these training sessions. Maybe they get good value of it, learn good principles, but then they go back out into the wild, and very shortly thereafter, you see a degradation, you see sort of like a regression back to either prior behaviors or unhealthy behaviors. Now, my theory is that there's a few factors. Some of it is environmental. I feel like the good thing about conferences, the good thing about workshops in general, is that it's almost like you're in an isolated chamber a little bit. You're already with people who are in a learning mode, and you're already with people, and you yourself are excited about the topic. It's not until you leave that sort of chamber, that safety, then you go apply those principles in the wild. Do you really determine whether or not those principles would resonate? So if you've learned wonderful principles, for example, if you watch this talk and you're like, oh, maybe this was useful, I'll take 2 or 3 things and I'll go back, then you might go back to the same environment, right? So your enthusiasm or new learning level might be here. The rest of the organization is over there, which means you will eventually get over here, right? Making sense? Making sense so far, right? Okay, good. So when we think about managers, a lot of these classes, a lot of these workshops focus on, good attributes of a manager, and we know what they are, right? They believe in experimentation, growth mindset, servant leader, buzzword here, buzzword there. Some of them are actually terrible advice, notwithstanding. For example, I was looking for some good images, and I came across this, and I was like, how is this possible that this is an actual leadership tip? Like, if you ever see this in anything that says that you need physical attributes to be a good leader, please just never, ever take into account. So what I'm trying to say here is there's good advice, there's bad advice, and that's fine in these sessions, but I think there's something missing. And so I'm going to ask you this question, and I want you to raise your hand to help maybe reveal what could be missing. Okay, by show of hands, over the span of your career, so think back, maybe it doesn't matter if it's 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, like me, 20 years, I'm a dinosaur, it doesn't matter. How many raise your hand if you've had at least one good manager. One. Glory. Okay. Raise your hand if you've had at least 2 good managers. Okay, a lot fewer hands. Let's see where I can get. Raise your hand if you've had at least 3 good managers. All right. Do you notice how few that list gets down? I'm really, really happy to hear that at least you've had one good manager to set a baseline of what good looks like. And I want you to think about that manager, and I want you to think about what made them good for you, because that's going to be where I try to hone in. Ultimately, what I'm trying to say here is that while training itself is invaluable, what matters is the values of that manager is probably what stuck in your head. In other words, in the previous slide, a lot of the examples of good managers are attributes, right? There are things that they do. There are actions that you see. And that's important. That's important because all we have are our actions sometimes. But as a leader, you need to ground yourself in the values. The values will drive the outcomes. And I think oftentimes that's the key missing piece that hinders both training and ultimately good intentional leadership to take root. So let's talk about a few of these values. Values in general is just to anchor us in a definition. Values in general is the notion of something that is long-lived and long-lasting part of yourself. It's an intrinsic part of yourself. It's not something that necessarily changes, but it anchors you and it roots your actions. And so when I think about my own values as a leader, one of them that's important to me is trust. Actually, the one I had here was called integrity. I kept editing the slides up to last minute, and the PDF, I didn't download the right version, but integrity, which to me, trust and integrity are similar enough that this is still work. In other words, my word, my commitment matters. My ability to get you to trust me, to support you as a leader, is based in your ability to trust me. I take that very seriously. So when that trust is broken, and I think this is an example, in my opinion, of a broken trust, we have broken a social contract. And the result of that breaking of the social contract is dissatisfaction and disillusionment with leadership. So to connect the dots here, what I'm saying is training is great. What matters, what makes a difference, and what makes training sticky are values. Knowing your values as a leader enables you to act with intention. And in my example, when your value is trust or integrity, every action needs to be an effect of that particular value. It is now your currency. It is now your social contract with your teams, and breaking it has consequences. Yeah, making sense? Nodding, good. Another, man, I missed the gifts, but we'll roll through. Another one, this is a squid that then becomes clear when you lift it out of the water. It's a defensive tactic. Another value of mine is clarity. In other words, as a leader, I think one of my first and most important jobs is to provide, or at least provide the environment for clarity. I'll give you a quick example. One of my teams, so I mentioned I have about 7 teams, one of those teams was struggling with a pre-market product. They were struggling to get a product out. Wonderful team, wonderful humans. But the struggle was in the lack of clarity about what is the ultimate goal. And it's so easy to see in hindsight or from far away, but it's a very hard thing when you're a team trying to get to it. Because even if you do all the right things, right, this team did A/B testing, they did feasibility studies, they did qual analysis, they did all these things, and still they were missing that clarity. My job, ultimately, even if I didn't have the answers necessarily, I didn't know, oh, this is what the team should be doing, this is what should be the product value fit, but that didn't matter. What mattered is I saw a lack of clarity, and I have a responsibility, I have an accountability to then step in and help provide that clarity. And so I did, through steps, and we could talk about those steps offline, but what's important here is the fact that I saw this as an intrinsic part of myself. Another one is courage, and I don't mean this fake courage where people, say things like, I take full responsibility for laying off 12% of the workforce. And then every CEO reports that. Is that real? Is that real courage? Is that a signal of real courage? Do you think that this is a courageous message? Exactly. I call that courage cosplay. Because really, what do you mean you take full responsibility? Did you lose your job? Oh, okay, no, you're still here giving the message. Did you take a pay cut? Oh, no, you didn't even take a pay cut. You might get a bonus. So where is that full responsibility? That is not courage. That is a courageous cosplay, and that is not a real value. So if my thesis so far is about the fact that what will make good leaders is, in addition to training, values, what do we do about that? What do we do with this information? What is the key takeaway here? Well, first and foremost, we as leaders, and in this case, I could mean people leaders, but I could also mean non-people leaders. A leadership role is not necessarily one where you manage people directly. It could be that you have leadership over a domain. You could have leadership over, you could have influence. You could have leadership, representational leadership, right? People look to you for a certain expertise. Those are all leaders. So these values, these practices should apply to anyone. But as leaders, we need to work on ourselves. And I talked about training a little bit, but I mean something a little bit differently. Are people familiar with personal canvases? Raise your hand if you're familiar. Okay, good, a few. So a personal canvas, also called the me canvas, is a super effective way of getting clear about your values. Because again, that should be your root. Like we talked about, I love Kevin Langley's talk about roots and trees and metaphors. So when you think about the root a little bit, you could use that as a loose metaphor for your values. And what a personal canvas does is it allows you to codify and crystallize what those values are for you. I gave you mine, right? Trust, clarity, courage. But yours might be slightly different. What's important, though, is being able to articulate those values and then connect it to your outcomes. And that's how a me canvas helps or a personal canvas helps. These are available everywhere online, so you can Google search for a template. But really, it's less about the template and more about the time you spend through the process of thinking about what your values are and how you will apply them, how you'll show up on a regular basis at work and tying them to the outcomes you have at work. Oh, I had another one here that didn't make the cut either. But has anyone done a self-assessment, like those personal self-assessments? Like, okay, a few people. One of my favorites is the Clifton's Strength Finders. And that one specifically is, you take a bunch of questions, about 35 questions or so, and then it gives you a report that helps you, that identifies your top strengths, and some things that, are not your top strengths, but certainly are helpful to know about. So for example, things like, I enjoy and I am good at driving outcomes. That kind of makes sense. That resonates with me and my values and my personality. But one of my development areas, to be honest, is about big fuzzy pictures, like living with big fuzzy pictures, because I try to drive with clarity sometimes. When I see something fuzzy and uncertain, my instinct kicks in to try to bring clarity. And sometimes that's not necessarily helpful in that moment. So I definitely recommend one of those types of assessments to help you identify it. And then the up level, the next level is, as a team, do those assessments together. And what I mean by as a team is, as a leader, I've done these assessments with my teams. I've done them with my peer teams. I've done it with the teams I support. Because it's good to see like what your catalog of strengths and development areas are together. And then together you could almost like map the blind spots and decide and discuss ways to cover that blind spot. The next one is practicing leadership as a craft. The fact that you're at CraftCon is a good sign, because it means you do practice, you fundamentally understand what craft means, be it software craft. What I'm proposing here is that leadership needs to operate similarly as a craft. And we need to invest in it, we need to nurture it, we need to hone it, all of those things just as we would. So some of that is formal training, but I find that my learning style is more conducive towards informal training. I love books, I read a lot. Technically at home, I have a small official library. If you have more than 1,200 books in the US, you can consider yourself a library. So I am an official library, and I have a little plaque. It's the cutest thing. I have a little plaque next to my bookcase. So for me, reading is a valuable way of learning information. And these are some of my favorite books on leadership: The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, Engineering Manager for the Rest of Us, Dare to Lead. What you'll notice here is these books don't only cover the topic of leadership. For example, I think it's very important to be situationally aware. As a leader, most of my teams, almost all of my teams, are exclusively in the US. So that, for me, means being aware of the social, economic factors of the US. It's easier because I also live there, and I'm also, I don't know, maybe you noticed, I'm also a black woman in tech. So a lot of these also come very naturally to me. But even if they don't, that's not the point. The point is you need to educate yourself about the systems in which your teams operate in order to be a good leader, because you need to be able to understand where they're coming from and meet them there. And so that requires more than reading about just leadership. It requires reading things like Lead Like an Ally. What does it mean to be an ally? Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me, which is a book about systemic racism. But whatever context you're in, make sure that you supplement your learning with not only leadership books, not only leadership classes, but these types of systemic books as well, context-setting books as well. Another thing I invest in terms of practicing as a craft is a wonderful, wonderful workshop by Ruth Milan called Technical Leadership Masterclass. And for me, what that does is it incorporates system design and triple D, so domain-driven design, systems thinking, architecture, into leadership. So as a leader, what do these concepts mean for me? How do I apply these concepts? So take it every about 2 years or so to refresh my skills and to stay up to date. But I find that as a leader, I have a responsibility to be able to help the organization design its next iteration, and I need to have the expertise and skills in order to do that. There's other ways too. The other two I mentioned here, I put here are Angie Jones. She is a VP at Block, and she has wonderful blogs. I see some of you nodding. Wonderful blogs incorporating both tech, largely Java, but still very applicable overall about tech design and leadership. And I find that very helpful just to keep my tech acumen up to speed as well. And then I will not pronounce his name because I don't want to embarrass myself, but the Pragmatic Engineer, that's a wonderful blog. I signed up for it. If your company gives you some kind of funding, sign up for it, or sign up for it as a group account to give me industry knowledge about what's going on in tech. So things like, here are how companies are thinking about layoffs. Here are the next biggest topics that companies across the industry are talking about. All of this is giving me situational awareness and context for my own leadership. Lastly, we want to find our communities. And what that ultimately means is that leadership is a group sport. So we need to find our teammates, right? It was easier when everybody was back in the office to find those teammates. There may be other leaders within your specific unique unit or domain. It could also be, leaders across the hall. It's a little harder to do now that some of us are remote. So I think virtual communities are just an important factor in your arsenal, because leadership is indeed a group sport. Sometimes you just need to get out of your own head. You need to pressure test things. You need to talk to somebody about something. You need to vent. For me, there are two things in this virtual community that I rely on. So I have a text group, and I call them my board of advisors. So these are various leaders where we've met at conferences, we've worked together, we respect each other. We're at various levels of leadership. Some of them are starting out, some of them are a little bit more seasoned, some of them are across different industries. It's about 6 or 7 of us now. And I call them my board of advisors, but like all of us, we call each other our board of advisors. And what we do is we just rely on each other for leadership topics. For example, after this talk, I am going to text them about how this went and about how I wanted to stay calm when the projector didn't work. You need somebody like that. You need somebody to help you relate. The other one that's important to me online is Black Tech Twitter, which is a subculture. I don't even know if it's sub right now, but it's a culture inside of Twitter of Black technologists. So people like Angie Jones, Paris Athena, myself, others form this community and inform each other. It's not only a great resource for sharing knowledge and information, but a lot of jobs happen that way too, right? The Black Tech Twitter pipeline is a strong one, including for jobs. So these are my communities. This is how I ensure that leadership is a team sport, especially virtually. And so the nudge here is to find your own community. Here's a few folks from Tech Twitter. Not all of them are from Black Tech Twitter, but a few folks from Tech Twitter who can get you started if you want to build that virtual community. So to conclude, I just love this quote about community too. I think that's like my key word for getting through 2023 and the chaos it is. The need for connection and community is primal. It's an innate part of ourselves. So find yours ultimately. So let me just wrap up and conclude a little bit by saying, we talked about what does good leadership look like. I shared a little bit with you about what good means to me, and ultimately it boils down to a leader that acts in accordance to their values. That's how I recognize a good leader. Then the question naturally surfaced, well, How do you become said good leader for some definition? And to me, the answer is, first of all, know what your values are so that you can act in accordance to those values. Let those drive your behaviors. 2, honing your craft by investing in your leadership. And 3, finding your community. I thank you so much for coming and listening to me today, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you so much, Nivia, and thank you so much for handling the technical difficulties like a champ. And here's a little reminder of your time in Budapest with your small picture in it.
Oh my God, this is the cutest thing. Look, y'all, it's a picture of me, and I have huge eyes. It's true. Thank you.
Of course. Only as a manager, but not a leader.
Oh, I love this question because that means whoever asked it knows the difference, and there is a difference. A manager is, at best, a set of tasks one completes. Sign off vacation requests, maybe schedule one-on-ones and do performance evaluations. They have the accountability for ensuring those tasks happen. That is not a leader. A leader, as we've just talked about, especially a good leader, acts with intention, acts with purpose, acts with value, hones their skills, etc. So what do I recommend for someone who is acting only as a manager but not as a leader? First, recognize that you are. And you know how sometimes there's a saying that says, if you're in a situation and somebody's pulling a con and you can't see the mark, then you are the mark. Similarly, if you're a leader and you're looking around and the situations around you are failing, you might be the one who's not taking ownership of your leadership. You might be just acting as a functional manager. And those signs are rather clear, and we could talk about them. So first, recognize it, and that's okay. As soon as you recognize it, then you could do something about it. You know, the concept of kaizen, continuous improvement, applies to leadership as well, meaning that you can continuously hone your own skills and hone your own craft. But first, you got to just recognize that maybe you're not quite a leader there yet.
Hone your craft indeed. Thank you so much, Nivia, for being here. Thank you for your energy.